Um, Speaking times, as you well know by now, are 6 to 8 minutes. I'll give you 1 warning clap at 6 minutes, 2 warning claps at 8 minutes, and 8 minutes 15, 3 warning claps to signal that we've stopped listening by that point. I'd like to call upon the affirmative, the first speaker of the affirmative, to speak to the motion.
Can I just confirm if I'm visible and audible?
Yes, you are.
When your doctor tells you that you have only 1 month to live, and this is probably the last time you're going to see Earth, negative team says, give up. On affirmative, we choose not to assume that. We think people are entitled to make decisions for themselves. And if it comes to the point when they've already exhausted all possible advice from medical professionals, we think the onus should be on them to choose how they want to live their lives. 2 arguments in this speech. Firstly, do individuals have a right to exercise what's best for them? And secondly, how there's a lacuna in medical science and why we need to award people the ability to choose alternative practices. Before this question, just 2 points by way of framing. The first is, who are part of this debate? Panel, we need to note that this debate doesn't focus on the majority of 80 to 90% of the population, because these are individuals who probably already believed in medical science, already taken vaccines on a speedy rate. This debate focuses on 3 primary contexts. The first is, these are individuals who are doubtful of treatments in medical science. Secondly, these are individuals that cannot afford the high cost of medical science and its treatment. And thirdly, there is no cure when it comes to medical science and professionals advising them. That's why this belongs within the small purview of these 10% of individuals that have no other options. And we believe that the final decision and consideration should be on them, and they should choose what treatment they should want to prefer. Second piece of framing, we need to note that there are contrasting opinions on unregulated medicine, and it's only because they have a great emphasis on data. What does this mean? In a lot of circumstances, the way in which alternative medicine is seen to be unvalidated or unregulated is because they use clinical data as a prerequisite to determine whether or not a medicine is effective. This is crucial because at a point in which clinical data proves that an alternative medicine is harmful, it will be banned, which means this debate is not about practices that are so bad, because clinical data will oftentimes show this. But the reason why there's oftentimes lack of regulation with alternative medicine is because clinical data has insufficient data to prove whether or not the data is harmful. That means the first preliminary attack they want to make here is there can be some level of validity and legitimacy of this medicine, because the metric that they're using it to base on whether or not it's effective is medical science, and we think that's just not good in the way in which you deal with alternative medicine. The third thing we want to note here is this is similar to the process of finding new drugs. That's exactly why when we want to find new drugs in terms of medical science, we make clinical data and we make individuals go through a clinical trial, and on a case-to-case basis, we'll prove whether or not it's legitimate through various level experiments. This is similar to what we're doing in alternative medicine, and that's why we're proud to defend it. First argument, do individuals have a right to exercise what's best for them? Judge, this argument is important because we'll tell you when exactly do we endorse this right? When do we allow individuals the ability to make right for their decision? 2 parts to this argument. The first is consent is always seen as a prerequisite in medical procedures. And this is important. We always make sure individuals are fully informed and rationalize whatever decision that they're making. We make sure whatever decision that they're making is one that is calculated. And the evidence for that is the way in which we allow individuals to have the ability to buy over-the-counter medicine in pharmacies, which means we do in status quo decentralize and give individuals the ability to diagnose and take medicine for themselves, and that's because they are fully rational and informed about the decision that they're doing. And in this particular motion, it's already fiated that these individuals have exhausted medical science and professionals, and the bottom line of what they want to do after they've reached a decision is something that is crucial. Secondly, it's important to note that this does not affect the third party, meaning to say the same right of bodily autonomy, every single methodologies or treatment that you're taking directly affects you and only you. It does not affect any other individuals, which means you are best equipped on making the decision. But finally, these are individuals who are desperate, meaning to say they have probably don't have enough amount of money. They don't have convincing medical advice from professionals to say that there's a cure. And in that desperation, what do? Do they stick to the doctor's advice and die, or find alternatives to at least give some level of assurance that things might be better? That's why in India, when the COVID crisis hit at its peak, patients didn't have beds to sleep on. Patients didn't have oxygen tanks to even facilitate the process of healing from COVID-19. Negative team says you can die because there's no other alternatives. At least that's why individual decided to go through alternative medicine, because at least there's some level of salve in the immediate shock of you having all of diseases. The conclusion of this first argument is we think individuals should have the right, and the ultimatum should be on them as opposed to other individuals telling what's best for them, because they know themselves best. Second argument, how there's a lacuna in medical science and why we need to diversify the way in which people make decisions. The importance of this argument is we will tell you why the counterfactual negative team may be problematic and why do we bridge that gap much better when we provide alternative medicine. The first preface to this argument is this debate is not about extremities like individuals taking rat poison. Obviously, this debate needs to be reasonably assessed, and people can make some level of decision to know legally within the frameworks of your country, these are alternative medicines that are endorsed. There's some level of regulatory mechanisms that are gone to this alternative medicine, and we allow them to access these sort of practices. Two parts to this argument. The first is there is no singular correct answer when it comes to medical science and diseases. And this is evidently for three reasons. The first is that it can be doubtful. Second, it can be high cost. And thirdly, that there's no cure. Let's deal with this one by one. The fact that it's doubtful. Two parts to this claim. The first is, even in medical science, there is no uniformity on what's best. And the evidence to that is, for example, in COVID-19, where the best scientists amalgamated and tried to find out a cure. We don't know if Pfizer is the best. We don't know if AstraZeneca is the best. That just goes to show that even when you have the best scientists or best experts to come to a consensus, it's still ambiguous and we are bombarded with an uncertainty. Second part to why it's doubtful is that science can make mistakes as well. The reason why Vioxx as a painkiller last time, which was endorsed on shelves, people bought it, but after various clinical trials, it was proven to have long-term effects that are bad for you and its side effects, which means science can also make mistakes as well. And we have clinical trials to adjudicate whether or not it's harmful. That perfectly falls within the purview of alternative medicine. And we can do that similarly as well. Thirdly, the cost is high. And this is crucial because there are ethnic minorities that cannot afford, they don't have enough money. And if they say you will die in 6 months or you take a treatment that causes you your entire life savings, what alternatives do you have? You can't lend money because probably loan sharks will go after you anyway or your family. So the only option is probably seeking some level of legitimate alternative treatment that can give you some level of salve. But finally, is that there is no cure to medical science. There are many diseases out there, we still do not know what's the cure. If you have cancer, the doctor will say, go to hospice or palliative care, but at least you can access some level of legitimate treatment like stem cell, like Ayurveda, that gives you some level of legitimacy in there. The bottom line of this is that we allow individuals to be accountable, meaning if a medical professional makes an error or advises you to take medical treatment, but you end up dying, that onus is on them and the liability is on them. How will you answer them? Will their license be taken away? Will the patients be fairly accommodated? At least in our world, when the accountability is given to you, you as an individual know what's best for you, and any harms you repeat on your own. For the sake of free choice and allowing individuals the onus to choose what's best for them, we're incredibly proud to affirm.
I'd like to thank the previous speaker for their remarks and invite to the floor First Negative to open the case for Negative Bench.
Awesome, just checking that you can hear me.
Yes, I can.
Perfect. We're going to win this debate by proving that accessibility of harmful drugs will expand to more people on Affirming side, and that companies will shift behavior in order to capitalize on a freer medical market. What we stand by and support is the existing regulatory regime where drugs that are administered by medical professionals have to be approved by regulators and go through extensive trial methodology to make sure there are no long-term harms we are unaware of, but also noting that things like experimental trials for people that are on their deathbeds and could have their life extended by a drug that is currently in the testing process are things that are accounted for under the status quo. People can apply for those kinds of things. So that shifts a lot of the material that the Affirming team tries to win this debate on. Before I go into substantive, a few pieces of extraneous rebuttal. The first thing they talk about is just those people in very specific cases where either they're in the very last months of their lives or are facing some sort of disease that has literally no cure on the market. I think the Affirming team mischaracterizes their burden in this debate, right? Because experimental drugs are already part of the existing regulatory drug process. I think that means that the Affirming team has to engage with the real issue, which is like the 40% of Americans who are hesitant about vaccines and get inundated with right-wing advertising that tells you that Ivermectin is just as efficient as a vaccine, who already asked their doctors about these things, but are currently told that there is no world in which that would be administered to them. They have to stand by those doctors saying, I really don't want you to do this, but if you want to, just come in the back and we'll sort you out with these pills. Their Hail Mary is just to say that if these drugs were bad, they would already be banned. But I think by their own admission, these are often areas where there are insufficient clinical trials, meaning that long-term harms are not captured by this. It is too soon to ban or allow this. But I think in instances where the benefit might outweigh those long-term harms are often limited to quite specific areas. So cancer patients may be able to take a very narrow set of drugs that you wouldn't give to other people, because though those drugs might extend life for people who only have a few months left to live, they would have numerous terrible effects for people living a long-term life. Would open these drugs up to literally everyone. The next thing they explain that there are already circumstances where patients can make choices. They talk about pharmacy drugs, which I would note either go through stringent approval or are literally prescribed by pharmacists. They talk about autonomy, to which we would say you can consent to treatment, but patients cannot often demand a treatment that doctors are literally not approved to give. But the final thing they say is that people would go to worse alternatives. And what I would note here is to say that alternative medicines are not currently provided by hospitals, which has implications we will discuss in later arguments. But I think that what this means for ACT is they have to prove that people who currently listen to their doctors will now say no to that doctor's advice and then go to alternative medicine under the status quo. It is unclear that that chain of logic is proved by the Affirming team. The final claim they make is just that science is not always 100% right. And judges, like, I just think this argument insults your intelligence, right? F wants you to believe that because regulators sometimes have debates before they come to a consensus, or it takes time for them to decide which medicine is most effective, that an individual who saw a Facebook post that said that birth control is going to save you from malaria is knowledgeable enough to demand that as a treatment just because the science is confusing. Unclear what they try to prove with this argument, but I'm not sure that they do get that. Why do they increase accessibility to harmful drugs? The first thing I'm going to explain is just why the state has an obligation to prevent people from harming themselves. And the first thing I would note is just that this is why drugs like heroin are banned, right? Because often people cannot freely consent to things that have immense long-term harms that you are unable to envision for yourself when you were thinking of the short-term disease or illness that you are facing. But the second thing I would note, and this is in direct contention with what Affirming tries to say, is just that the state has immensely more knowledge than any regular pundit does. Regulators understand and know things that we do not, because it is their job to purse over the science every day. That scientific knowledge can be quite confusing. As Af notes, there are often competing narratives that make it really difficult for an individual to decide what is the most correct and most knowledgeable science. We trust the state to make a call on this decision by having experts that dedicate their life's work to ensuring that they make the most correct call for the situation. But the final thing I would say is that doctors have a literal obligation to protect people from harm. That is a Hippocratic oath they take when they decide to go into this profession. I think if we're talking about vitiating consent in this debate, is quite harmful to tell doctors they ought to administer drugs that will harm people. Why are these drugs and treatments necessarily harmful? The first thing I would note is that obviously by the motion itself, these are drugs and treatments that are not approved under the status quo by regulators. And the reasoning for that is often just that there are concerns about long-term harms that we are currently unaware of, that we need more information on before we can decide whether this drug is an appropriate treatment for the specific illness that it claims to support. What do regulatory bodies consider when they are making these decisions? I think the first thing to note is just that there are actually broadly incentives to get drugs out as fast as safely possible from two angles. The first is that the government applies, I think, significant pressure on regulators to to stop harms accruing to individuals and to save lives. Importantly, because it does just look bad to sit on drug regulation politically if it looks like a drug is going to work. And it also is obviously just a huge win to claim that you're able to push really good life-saving drugs through, like the Trump campaign claimed vaccines to their project, which is named whatever. That's a really good win for them. But I think pressure also applies from the companies that are producing these drugs, because they obviously want to make a profit. They want to make sure that regulators are considering these quickly. The next thing I would say is that these pressures that apply from both angles also scale with the intensity of the problem at hand. So COVID vaccines were released quite early, were pushed through the regulatory process quickly because the problem was immediate and that government pressure increased. I think the impact of this is that when drugs are not approved immediately, even with all of these incentives in place to make sure that they are approved as quickly as possible, it is often because there are 4 specific reasons as to why that is untrue, why it is unlikely to be approved. The first is that these drugs are just unlikely to have an immediate significant benefit that is visible to regulators. The second is that they are likely to have some level of irreversible harm that will accrue in the future. The third is that there are likely to be alternatives to these drugs already on the market that already solve the problem. But the fourth is likely that the scale of the problem allows for regulators to move slowly, because it is unlikely that billions of people will die if this drug is not approved. What happens when these drugs are approved early? I think the first thing to note is that even if there are no immediate harms, often these are the kinds of harms that will show in the future. It results in things like entire generations of women having fertility issues and not realizing until 2 decades later that it's linked to a birth control pill, resulting in like mass distrust in the NHS in Europe, right? I think the process of regulation is actually important for considering these long-term harms, because they can be deadly and life-altering in irreversible and immeasurable ways. Why are people more likely to take these drugs under the affirming side? I mean, under the status quo, the first thing to note is just that regulation is already an important signaling effect. If something is not approved, it is likely not safe. So people just do not take it if the hospital does not administrate it. I think on F, people will take it even if it is advised against. Why is that the case? The first is obviously just clickbait and like advertising, right? As soon as hospitals buy into this and provide it, you give legitimacy to all that advertising. It looks like people online saying like the X drug works really well, and doctors just think the vaccine is better. That's why they're advising you against it. But because they administrate it, obviously must work. I think the second thing to note, though, is obviously science advice is really complicated. So it is easy for an individual in the doctor's office to outweigh things they do not understand. And doctors struggle to explain why it is that a drug they're willing to administer is not as effective as other drugs and ought not to be taken, especially when you've downweighed the importance of regulation to say, even though it's unregulated, we will still administer it. The final thing to note, though, is that this is a mutually exclusive issue, because to some extent, people do trust hospitals in administering drugs. If hospitals do not give these drugs, you don't actually go elsewhere, right? Because you're not as comfortable with someone who is not a professional administering care to you, but you also just trust less that the product you will get from a random is genuine, or that you will be monitored safely afterwards. All this means that the affirming side opens up a huge group of people that will access potentially incredibly harmful drugs. The final thing to note, however, is they incredibly change companies' incentives to produce these drugs at a higher rate. It is likely that things like testing decrease in favor of things like advertising at the point where you no longer require regulation. The scale of harm increases massively on the affirming side. Proud to propose.
I'd like to thank the previous speaker for their remarks and invite to the floor second affirmative to continue the case for affirmative bench.
Sorry. There are 2 clarifications I want to make about affirmative case before moving into responses and positive material. The first is, this debate are not about individuals who have no faith in the system of medication, because the individuals that they're talking about, 40% who choose to be unvaccinated, are individuals who genuinely believe that that there's a controversy and conspiracy against them, either that the vaccines make them gay or either that the vaccines cause them testicular disorders. This debate is not about them, because the motion in info slide specifically states that these are individuals that have received medical advice and at the end have a determination to take contrary advice or do not choose to follow that advice. In these instances, why do people take contrary advice if they were individuals who don't believe in the medication system in the first place? It is because of the three reasons that Kuhan highlighted. The fact that they are doubtful of the system. The second, the fact that the treatment is too expensive, or the fact that there is no cure. Every mitigatory analysis that you hear from negative about how there's pressure and incentive for governments to make drugs as fast as possible, to claim credit for discovering drugs and for treatments to be as effective as possible, to ensure trust of individuals, all reduce the percentage of individuals who choose to opt into alternative treatment, but it does not eliminate this group of individuals completely. What do I mean by that? There will always be diseases that you cannot cure. No matter how much you subsidize, there are always going to be ethnic minorities or groups of individuals that cannot afford expensive costs. No matter how certain you are of medical professionals that vaccines work, there will always be individuals who doubt the system because of the fact that the system is infallible, that the system has failed multiple times. What is the first evidence of this? The first is, if you look at the scandal, if you look at painkillers that have been recalled off shelves because it has caused long-term problems like addiction to painkillers, causing back problems and causing other issues that have continuously happened throughout the time of science, means that the long-term harms are symmetrical on both sides, where there's irreversible outcomes and whatnot. That is not a consideration in the debate, because even in clinical trials where they test this medication, the best that they can do is see what the effects are in clinical trials are. What are the effects after 6 months? What are the effects after a year? It is impossible for regulation, even in status quo, no matter how thorough they are, to know the long-term harms. Therefore, in terms of seeking treatment, long-term is really not a consideration that you should buy in this debate. Even if it is worse on our side, at best, it is a wash. Second, on this idea of advertising and making a harmful medication more accessible to individuals. Again, they're not comparing it to status quo. Firstly, any medication that has been tested by the FDA and is deemed to be harmful is still considered regulated. It is just that it is banned, right? Regulated medicine doesn't mean medication that is correct. It also means medication that has been banned off shelves. So for the uniquely harmful medications, it already works in our favor because they are banned. But more importantly, they don't nuance or contextualize medications that are unregulated or treatment that are unregulated to be unsafe, because individuals are not stupid. People who opt to go into medical doctors and receive advice about treatment are not individuals that are going to drink bleach or take hydrochloroquine to stop COVID. These are individuals that either feel that the access to vaccines are not there, or individuals who feel this treatment is expensive. Then they opt into alternative treatment that has some data to show that there can be success. It's just that this data or this type of model is not satisfactory to federal regulators. But that doesn't mean that these treatments are unsafe. They needed to prove their burden as to why individuals will purposely take perniciously harmful medication and cause death throughout this time, when they have no evidence of showing you why the alternative treatments that individuals take are most oftentimes natural with no preserved additives, but secondly and more importantly are simply alternatives in hope of creating hospice care to be more comfortable. The last thing I want to talk about before I move on is that the considerations of regulators and whether they are as strong as the negative tries to claim. They tell you that these are people that are experienced in their jobs. These are people that make no mistakes. First of all, I think the evidence of the fact that we've recalled medications multiple times before is not true and defeats this statement, which is the reason why it causes doubt and discomfort in certain populations of group, which makes this discomfort valid. But secondly, they've also been complicit in multiple RICO busts in the United States. For example, the Oxycontin scandal that cut out the Purdue Pharmaceuticals, which caused the opiate crisis in the 1990s, are all examples of how the regulatory bodies themselves were complicit in this problem. But even if you buy that regulators are the best, here is how my positive material will engage and tell you why it is still okay for people to make that choice. Because I don't think they've responded why, even if we have to defend certain groups of people making choices, that choices is fair. The last thing I want to talk about is this issue of Ivermectin and people taking in injections and whatnot. I think it's not fair for them to suggest that these individuals are taking these options, because individuals who have taken these options at that time, Ivermectin is used in India, which means it is a relatively safe drug, and the opinion around it is different according to different contexts. But secondly, and more importantly, the individuals who attempted to take ivermectin at that time was because there was no access to an available vaccine. There was difficulty of trusting individuals injecting needles in the hopes that it will cause these problems. These are all instances where people have defaulted to the alternative and they still survive. I don't think they can show you that there's a significant number of people that defaulted to ivermectin and then caused great societal harm, and then more people went to ivermectin instead of people going to AZ, Pfizer, AstraZeneca, Johnson & Johnson. Given the fact that this comparative is not true, it goes you to show why our comparative is likely true. Now, let's talk about why people with more niche diseases are likely to suffer. Firstly, how are traditional treatments and medications in their world, in current status quo, regulated? It is by pharmaceutical companies. If you recognize, pharmaceutical companies, even those that are backed by state and given state subsidies, are individuals that are concerned in profit. There are 3 stages in order to regulate a specific treatment. The first is extremely high cost of R&D. You have to spend millions of dollars in order to test out a specific combination of chemicals will create the ailment to the disease. The second is this process takes a long time. From the beginning stages of mixing these chemical compounds up to the time that you end clinical trials and show that there's a successful opportunity to treat treatments. The last thing is that these are patented. That means even when you are successful over this expensive cost, you are only given exclusive right to sell this medication for a period of time. All of this means that pharmaceutical companies are going to prioritize diseases that are common. They're going to prioritize problems that people face as common. This is why there's a lot of medication for AIDS, there's a lot of medication for cancer, there's a lot of medication for the common flu, but there's no medication for Stoneman's syndrome. There's no medication for Hutchinson's disease. Why? Because there's no inherent incentive structure to cater to this group of people. Because even if you create a successful treatment, the number of individuals that can afford this treatment is first going to be low, because the amount of profit that you can generate per customer needs to be extremely high so that you can turn in a profit. But secondly, and more importantly, there's no certainty that once these individuals are cured, they will fall back to the treatment. All of this goes to show you that individuals where the system has no incentive to protect them, why must they give up control of them of their medical decisions to a system that purposely locks them out? Bottom line is there's no indication to show that people who want contrary treatment can demand the hospital to give them treatment. If the doctor says, here's the vaccine, you cannot demand for ivermectin from the hospital. They will still decide who prescribes it. Individuals who take contrary advice are individuals who go outside of this system in hopes of finding care from anywhere else. Why they don't deserve this right, I don't think negative have shown why they are burdened. For those reasons, proud to be on affirmative.
I'd like to thank the previous speaker for their remarks and invite to the floor second negative to continue the case for a negative bench.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Awesome. Just give me 1 sec. Cool. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I just want to clarify something that I think the affirming team's a little confused about, because they keep talking about alternative medicine like hospice care and things like Ayurvedic things, or like, homeopathy. Those things aren't banned, but also not the things that hospitals are able to administer. So in their world as well, the individuals with no hope for a cure are still able to go to those other kinds of things that'll make their life feel better or give them some sort of hope and purpose on our side of the house as well. What we're not okay with is for drugs that are banned, because all drugs are banned until they go through the approval process, not being given to individuals. And note, our analysis suggests that it's not just the individuals that are completely desperate for a solution that go for these drugs. Given the ways that people advertise all these other sorts of alternative medicine, means quite a few people are likely then to take this drug when it's available and not trust scientific advice, because if the doctors are saying it's bad, how come the government and the hospitals themselves are allowing you to take it, right? And that's why we think there's a lot of nuance in this debate that has been lost on the affirming team. I'm going to show you two things, the two contributions that Meg's going to bring to you to win this debate. Firstly, how individuals are harmed under their side of the house and why that's important. Secondly, why we significantly changed the incentives on companies in the way they produce drugs and how that is further exacerbating the long-term harms to the medical system in general, obviously harming people in the long term. Firstly, in terms of how people end up harmed, right? So the first thing I want to take down is the idea that about consent, that you can consent to this, so therefore you should be able to do this. The first thing to note, as they say, is consent is necessary in delivering a drug, because they say delivering treatment, it's a prerequisite, but it's not sufficient. That's why some things you can't buy over the counter and why we have prescriptions. And the prescriptions are important, right? Because sure enough, the prescription system was kind of fucked in the US. It's better in other areas. And that's why we don't have an opioid crisis in those other areas. So by their own logic, when someone goes to a doctor and their side of the house, given the motion, and the doctor says, do not take opioids for all these reasons, but someone's like, no, I feel pain, give me an opioid. Their side of the house has to allow them to have that opioid. Now, here we go. No necessarily third-party harm. You're harming yourself and getting addicted to opioids, but the system in general and the legitimization of the system does harm a lot of people and is something that the government should stop. But the second thing to note is that consent actually isn't possible in these instances because it's not properly informed. Because the reason that this drug isn't approved is because there are unknown long-term harms that if an individual doesn't know about, can't possibly consent to. The second layer of analysis of an unresponded to an Umbar is that it's often irreversible. Another layer of reasons as to why you shouldn't allow individuals to just simply consent to this if they aren't able to consent away from it after they've opted into it. The next layer of analysis they give to you is that it doesn't affect a third party. The difference here is in terms of a doctor administering the drug or the government administering the drug to hospitals, it's very different from that individual doing something their own. So if the government is directly complicit in harming individuals, it doesn't need to be a third party action here because you are harming individuals. But also there doesn't need to be a third party harm to actually ban something. Look at recreational drugs. A third thing, as I've already noted, it does harm other people. Our analysis basically how it changed incentives of people by legitimizing, but incentives of companies as well. What does this mean in the overall debate? The first thing is not necessarily desperate individuals, because as I said, alternative medicine like Ayurveda isn't banned. But secondly, if it's about experimental drugs, something that Umbar said to no response, you are able to opt into those trials in the status quo, right? Especially in those instances where there are no cures, which means a lot of the very, very small groups of individuals that are supposed to have a benefit don't actually have a unique benefit outside affirming. They have to deal with the larger part of this debate that we brought to you. How do people end up harmed? The first thing we brought to you is why these drugs are likely to be harmful. The obvious analysis here is they're not approved, which means there are concerns about long-term harm there. The second affirming speaker tried to frame this as mitigatory, but it's not a mitigation of anything, right? It's proof that unapproved drugs are likely going to be harmful. We told you why there are incentives on regulatory bodies, government pressure and company pressure to actually provide good drugs to individuals when they need it, which means that it scales with the problem at hand, right? Look at COVID vaccines. So the example of India, for example, is actually, first of all, I don't know why it's a good example for that side, because 2A goes on to say that it caused harm and caused people not to get Pfizer and AZ vaccinations. So that's probably a harm if you allow this to happen, even if the regulatory body hasn't done this. But to the extent that India did approve it because they had no other alternatives, those are the other levers that regulatory bodies have. So to the extent that there are no other options, governments are likely to approve these things even if there are harms, because that's a decision the government is making. This debate is about instances where the government hasn't made that decision. So there are alternatives where individuals, whether they should be able to take this in their side of the house as well. So since they aren't approved, they're unlikely to be a benefit, there's likely to be irreversible harm, but also likely with the presence of other alternatives. What does that mean then in terms of individuals taking this? We've given you a lot of analysis as to why the current system is good, because even though you get news and advertising to try and take these drugs that aren't approved, the fact that hospitals, a relatively trusted body for the majority of individuals, aren't providing this means you're unlikely, first of all, to even expect to take that drug. But secondly, even if you want to, unlikely to turn to untrusted third sources to be able to do that. Maybe a tiny minority of people would do that, but they do that on their side of the house anyway, right? So there's no difference in this debate. The second thing we said there was that these individuals aren't dumb. Yes, they're not the ones who are going to drink bleach, but that's the nuanced middle ground that we told you about, right? These drugs aren't bleach. They're advertised to you as having some sort of good outcome, but there is no evidence at all that they don't have those long-term harms. So much evidence that it isn't approved in the status quo. Note again that their response conflates natural ingredients, hospice care that aren't banned, but also I'm not even sure if doctors can actually do Ayurveda or acupuncture, so I'm not even sure where the debate actually lands on having doctors do that for you. So it's not about conspiracy theorists, but people who get fake news, and the affirming side changes that perspective, because if it was so bad and the doctor's telling you it's so bad, why is the government actually providing it for you? That means you get a lot of harms in the house to individuals across the board, mostly harms there. But secondly, I'll extend this further and say it actually harms people outside these hospitals, right? Because again, the same norm change about regulatory drugs having to be approved for it to be safe, it's no longer the case, right? Now, if I go to the doctor, they can give me unapproved drugs, which shows to me that maybe these unapproved drugs aren't bad at all. That just increases scams, right? Because that doesn't mean you have to go to a hospital. Now that the norm shifts in terms of how you trust regulators and undermining regulators, you're more likely to buy Alex Jones medicines for COVID that might harm you in the long term. And this is far worse because even hospitals have no way of dealing with that or stopping you. That's the first path to victory that I think we've conclusively proven. It's very late at third affirming to actually give us a case. Second path to victory, we actually changed the incentives on companies themselves. So the high cost of R&D, all the stuff they're talking about, doesn't actually change to benefit on their side, because on their side, they still don't get medication for those individuals, proper medication, because there's lack of profit from those areas. But what you do get is companies maybe having a benefit for those people, or just not putting R&D and money into testing, for example. They do a lot of testing that then gets passed to the FDA as well, but instead now spending their money on advertising. Because if you can make people believe that they can have this drug, and even if doctors say no and they still want this drug, the hospitals have to buy that drug, people have to buy that drug. Those perverse incentives on companies means they produce more drugs that aren't actually good, probably long-term harmful for individuals, and fewer drugs that are actually good and safe. That leads, combined with Umbar's hesitancy material, to worse outcomes for medication in the future. Very, very proud to stand on side negative.
I'd like to thank the previous speaker for their remarks and invite third affirmative to the floor to conclude the substantive portion of the affirmative case.
Hi, just checking that I'm audible and visible.
Yes, you are.
Okay, thank you. Okay, starting in 3, 2, 1. I think negative has been extremely uncharitable and unengaging in the frame in which you provided for this debate, and just a basic understanding of what alternative treatments are, because they've been able to run a lot of analysis as to why this treatment is one that's extremely harmful, without engaging in a lot of our analysis of how these treatments actually do work. It's just that they don't have the regulation, the approval necessary as compared to what these standards in big pharma is. If I'm able to take down the implicit premises that negative relies on, I can take this debate. I'm going to deal with my speech like this. I'm going to deal with the two implicit premises that negative relies on. And then secondly, I'm going to deal with the question of which side provides the best medical experience in twofold. Firstly, on the frame of patients and result, and secondly, to the medical market. Now, the implicit premises, and I think this part of my speech is extremely important because a lot of negative's case is premised on these two things that is just rooted in, frankly, ignorance. The first is to suggest that hospitals cannot administer these type of treatments that don't have approval, and it is unfair for you to force doctors to administer this treatment. Yeah, obviously that is true. Neither have we proven any of our analysis that doctors have ever had to be forced to administer this treatment, and obviously hospitals don't administer this treatment. What we have are literal treatment centers which you can go to access these kind of alternative treatments. They're literal Ayurvedic treatment centers in India that you're able to access this type of medicine. Obviously, doctors wouldn't tell you go to India and get this type of medicine, but it still exists and it's still a valid option for these individuals. This argument is important because the negative have used this to negate a lot of the benefits of alternative treatment that big pharma does not necessarily condone, or that regulatory bodies do not necessarily condone. But what negative does is block out a lot of individuals from the choice or the right to access this type of treatment. The second implicit premise that I want to discuss on side negative is that these drugs are one that are extremely harmful. I want to first note that just because this medicine isn't regulated, it hasn't been given approval, doesn't mean it's necessarily harmful. Regulation just means that it has been approved, whether it's been banned or allowed. Because had not been banned, it just at worst on our side means that there's no conclusive evidence to say that it is extremely good or is extremely effective for a large majority of individuals or for a large majority of people that they have run clinical trials on, but it is neither one that is extremely harmful as to warrant a lot of negative claims how individuals will be extremely harmed on their side. This is why all the analysis as to why this drug is extremely harmful, or why the analysis of clinical trials itself just doesn't make sense, right? Our analysis as to why these drugs do offer some type of benefit for these individuals is one that is important, because on the negative side, as I've said before, you lock them out. Second part of my speech, I'm going to answer the question as to which side provides the best medical experience to layers, patients, and the market as a whole. Firstly, on patients, we started off this debate with, I think, a framing that is quite charitable, because we told you this is an individual that has received advice from the system, which implies that there is some belief in the system. These are not people who are just full out right-wing anti-vaxxers. Never have we defended them in any way. These are people, we frame them in three prongs. Firstly, people are desperate, which is why they're listening to advice and even considering alternative treatment. These are individuals who could not seek solace from the normative system. These are all probably individuals suffering from cost and probably can't access the cost of medicine that exists in big pharma, because we all know how big pharma screws people over. But also thirdly, these are probably people who don't find a viable cure in science and want some type of hope in a system that is able to treat them, even if it is in the worst case not able to treat them. I'll prove conclusively why that's still better. Our baseline was just to tell you that a person has a right to undergo this treatment when they have the consent to be able to do this and it does not harm a third party, then they should be afforded this right. The material from negative that clashes with this is to tell us that this type of accessibility is bad because an individual is not able to consent. I think this is where our framing is important, right? Because this is a person who is already faced with a dire situation and some type of limited choice to be made. So in that regard, I don't think we can judge consent based on the metrics of a normal individual who is not facing such a dire situation. In this regard, we should judge consent based on the right of the individual to access the most viable option for them, even if it does not make sense to us, because what we provide for individuals at the end of the day is some type of hope in a treatment which they were not able to find in the conventional way, but also at least in the worst case, even if it does not work out, at least they were able to say that they were able to take accountability for that choice that they made in of itself. A few things I want to respond to from Affirmative. They told you that people cannot consent because there's advertising and clickbait that's extremely harmful. I think it's funny that they want to defend this and also tell you that big pharma can amp up their medications and render to doctors when it is literally worse on their side. I don't know why this is a viable option. I think this type of harm is at best symmetrical. The second thing that they told us as to why people cannot consent is there are unknown long-term harms. I think we've made this argument one that is extremely symmetrical as well, because we told you that this exists on both sides. We proved this conclusively by giving you very accessible examples for i.e. vaccines that have been approved in a year and has caused long-term harms in individuals. So even if it is true that there is risk on both sides, what we explain to you is why taking on that risk is one that is extremely justified for this patient that has probably exhausted a lot of other options and is seeking some form of medicine. I think even if it is true that they don't consent, I'll analyze the best case and worst case. The worst case is it only affects them and it at least adds some data to the regulation of this treatment. So I don't see why Negative's argument about how we are totally against regulation is one that makes sense. But in the best case, we offer them some level of comfort, some level of treatment. And I just want to make it clear, if it really doesn't work work for them, we're assuming that this person is a very reasonable, average individual, right? This person can opt out as alternative treatment and go back to the conventional treatment. So I don't know why it's so harmful that it affects these people to that much of a large extent. Don't let negative get away with overblowing this to a disproportional level. The second level of my speech is to discuss the medical market as a whole. Negative told us that it's better for us to regulate faster and it holds like companies to a higher standard. Firstly, I don't know how this argument holds much water because it's obviously a debate about the right of the individual to access treatment. I think at best we make the market one that is more better because we're actually now allowing individuals to not be shamed into boxing themselves into one choice because science advocates for it to be so. I think we've given you substantive analysis to prove as to why science could endorse both things, but there are just a lot of arbitrary factors as to why alternative treatment does not get the necessary regulation. I think I've told you a lot of reasons as to why this regulation is one that is arbitrary in nature and follows different cultures and standards, i.e. Ivermectin being approved in India when it hasn't been approved anywhere else, right? So now I'm going to do some best case, worst case analysis. I think I've already told you as to why in worst case on our side, when this individual takes actual bad medicine that harms them, there are two options for this individual. This person can opt out of that. And if it is harm, there's some net benefit in terms of the industry itself that is providing this type of treatment. They can at least find some way in which to prove this treatment and to provide solace for other individuals. What the frame in which debate operates is one where an individual is in a desperate situation and has exhausted all their options. I think in that regard, we should at least allow them more choice as to what they're able to do with their lives, given that they're facing a situation that no one else would wish upon themselves. In that regard, at least we've provided to you a few things. Firstly, that at least they are able to consent to this and there's no third party harm. This individual has the right to choose this type of treatment. And secondly, on a level as to which we're able to provide better treatment for individuals as a whole, are very proud to affirm.
I'd like to thank the previous speaker for their remarks and invite the third negative speaker to conclude the substantive portion of today's debate.
Okay, hi, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, starting in 3, 2, 1. Bit absurd for the affirmative team to claim that they have been charitable with their characterization. On one hand, they say that this debate is only about alternative medical treatments which won't be administered by doctors anyways, but then they say this is about medical treatments which haven't already been banned. We're not banning alternative medicine, so clearly all these people that want alternative medicines administered by people other than doctors can still access it on our side. We are talking about the harms of allowing doctors to prescribe medications for drugs which have not been approved for particular uses, right? That's what the debate's about. That's what the example and the info slide is about. Absurd from the other team. I'm going to look at 3 things in my speech. Firstly, the right of a patient to choose. Secondly, about access to potentially good medicine. And then finally, about the harms and why we win this debate. Firstly, on the right to choose. 4 reasons why there's no right to choose that we have told you in this debate. Firstly, people's consent is never absolute, and the state often takes a paternalistic role to protect them from harm. Secondly, consent in medicine is not about, consenting to just being able to have whatever you want done to you. It's about consent to a particular procedure being done to you, right? So someone can't do something to you without your consent, but you can't force a doctor to do anything to you, right? And that brings me to my third thing. I would actually say that this undermines the consent of a doctor who has sworn a Hippocratic oath to do no harm, right? And obviously doctors are administering some drugs in this debate. But fourthly and finally, there are societal effects of you having this drug administered to you, right? Because we have talked to you about the way that this changes the incentives of pharmaceutical companies. So they produce more unsafe drugs, they advertise those more perniciously, and more people are conned into taking on drugs which they may otherwise not take, which may do harm to their health, right? Those are societal harms which should outweigh your individual autonomy. So clearly, choice is not a way for them to win this debate. But let's talk about their thrust in this debate, which has been about access to potentially good medicine. What they started off by saying was that medical science is flawed because it can, there can be mistakes made because there's no necessary consensus. Umbar already tells you that firstly, medical science isn't that bad. Secondly, that there are incentives to get medicines regulated really quickly, both from the government in terms of social utility and social pressure, but also in terms of private incentives to make money. And finally, that people can still access clinical trials, right? What the other team responds with is just pointing out a whole lot of instances in which the government or regulators might make bad decisions, right? So they say, oh, the opioid crisis happens. Oh, the vaccines might have long-term health effects and those got approved. But crucially, these are only examples where the state has approved medicines which have, accidentally been harmful. The affirmative team has never been able to posit an example where the government or regulators have withheld a potentially good treatment. And that's because they always err on the side of doing whatever is needed. So for example, in an emergency like COVID, they make the decision to release something like a vaccine because they know that that will be the best option because of the desperation of the people, right? I just feel like we've told you why the government has the best incentives in this debate. And obviously they would never choose to withhold something that the public want, that they would need. So I don't think they've provided us a response that proves to you that there are going to be all these magical new medicines that help people, who have otherwise been failed by the system, right? But then they pivot to talking in second affirmative about, unique rare diseases. And they give a whole heap of reasons why companies are not incentivized to develop medicines or cures for these diseases. But then they provide no reason why this changes, right? So obviously on their side of the house, all these things unfortunately still plague sufferers of those diseases. But I would say there are still incentives, for companies to try and make drugs that help rare diseases. Maybe it's because they're a nonprofit. Maybe it's because they have a personal interest, or it's about social utility. Maybe it's because they want the pride of being the first person to solve that disease, right? So I don't think these people are an entirely lost cause. I just feel like they've not managed to prove a significant change for those people. So basically what we've done at this point in the debate is we've shown you that basically if there's a medicine that might be good for people, it's probably been approved for the appropriate uses, right? So let's talk about the people then that have no other options, that are completely desperate, that are absolutely poor. Firstly, I would just say, if the above options are not available, it's unclear why their lives are going to be saved by the other team. But secondly, I would say that even if there are good options available, it's unclear why those are the options that they're going to access, right? Because Umbar tells you that it's very hard for lay people to dissect scientific information. When you're in an emotional state of mind, when you're scared of your loved one dying, you're more prone to listening to trolls on the internet who tell you that your loved one should take Ivermectin for COVID-19. So it's highly unlikely that you access good medicines, and you may just fall prone to all the stuff we told you in our societal point about how, companies are going to target you with their drugs that are not necessarily well regulated. But finally and thirdly, even if the affirmative team proves no, actual medical help to these people, and just remember, we're still allowing alternative treatments and hospice and stuff like that, they say that it's just good to let them have hope, right? At least I think that's what they try to say. But I don't think there actually is a benefit to letting these people just, have some treatment option, because the reality is their family is probably putting in the last of their savings into this treatment option, right? The affirmative is talking about poor families in India who are spending the rest of their money on this random, this random treatment that is obviously not going to compensate for the lack of oxygen which they had in India, right? That treatment is not going to save your family, but it is going to take away all of your savings. It is going to make life shit for you. We think that is terrible of them to support. Okay, now what do we prove in this debate? Firstly, we proved that there was immediate harm, that these drugs were bad and it was bad to administer them. The other team just says, oh, all drugs that are bad are already banned. That doesn't engage with the fact that drugs all have side effects. That's why they've been approved for specific uses where the benefits of the drug outweigh the side effects. Letting people use these drugs for other uses means they have to suffer those side effects with no benefit. That is a problem. We also told you that more people take them, right? And I think the flaw of the other team has been to assume that this debate isn't about people who don't already engage with the state, and it's just about people who are really smart. But clearly, I think there's a middle ground of people that, exist on Facebook, have fallen on the wrong side of the algorithm and get lots of fake news about scientific treatment that might even sound scientific because it's been really well written, but they still trust their doctors because they grew up in a hospital. They have, they have like faith in doctors because they're the ones that they grew up with. That's where they received all their treatment from, right? They didn't exactly grow up, accessing alternative medicine the whole time. So clearly, when your doctors start saying they're willing to give you this treatment, even though it's not legit yet, you have some sort of faith in it, you're more likely to take it. Whereas on the other hand, you are clearly unlikely to go and try and source a random drug off the black web and inject it into yourself, right? We think that was the harm that we proved in this debate. But beyond that, we told you that you actually, ruin the incentives on companies. And that was because it suddenly becomes more profitable them to immediately invest in advertising for their drugs instead of testing those drugs, instead of investing in, R&D, and instead of trying to find a genuine solution that actually helps people, right? And the failing of the other team has just been to say, firstly, that they're smart, that consumers are smart and won't fall prey to ads. I've already dealt with this, but I'd like to say, I think those ads get worse if they're produced by companies who market their drugs quite clearly and in like a scientific way, as opposed to just trolls on the internet. So I think that becomes particularly dangerous. But secondly, Third F says it's symmetric. Obviously it's not, because in our world, we uniquely make sure that companies can only profit from those drugs when they actually go through all the steps to make sure they pass regulation. What are the harms of this? It means that you have a world where companies are not producing the medicines people need and just putting out unsafe drugs onto the market and perniciously preying on desperate people to use them. That sucks. Proud to negate.
I'd like to thank the previous speaker for their remarks and invite to the floor the negative reply to deliver the negative reply.
Awesome. I think we outlined the clash in this debate clearly. It is, do we trust governments and state regulators to make decisions on whether drugs are safe in the context that it will be administered? And if not perfectly safe, whether it is totally necessary in that context because alternatives do not exist or there's a pressing need? Or do we let individuals override government decision-making mechanisms to demand treatments that have not yet been approved and have no legitimate mechanisms to allow for use? I think the question clearly resolves in our favor, because what are the assumptions that the panel has to believe in order for the affirming team to have a pathway to victory? The first is that scientifically, if a drug is not outright banned, then it must not be harmful. But that secondly, this debate is limited to the most vulnerable people who have no alternative medication or are on the dying bed, and that all other actors are unlikely to be susceptible to medical advertising that convinces them that an inadvisable drug is necessary for their condition. I think that both of these assumptions are shaky at best. Why is it the case? The first thing to consider is the way that the regulatory process works under the status quo and whether good medicine is being locked away from individuals who need it. Because the issue for this affirming team is that I think we give a clear conception of how regulation works under the status quo, which is to say that it is a system that considers various competing issues and makes a decision based on the best information available to experts whose entire livelihood relies on understanding the science. The only response the affirming team gives is to point to the 0.01% of medicines that get recalled because a new long-term harm is discovered. But intuitively, that is a lower mistake rate than individuals. Because on their side, I could just request my doctor to provide me an opioid every time I sprain my neck. And doctors might say, hey, I'd really rather you not do this because opioids aren't good for this ailment. But I could just say, I disagree because Purdue told me that it's a miracle fix for everything, so you ought to administer it anyway. And doctors have no capacity to reject me. Clearly, it is better for drugs that are fit for a single purpose to be limited to that purpose because state regulators often make these weigh-ups for us in a better way. That is to say that perhaps opioids are a useful medication as a matter of pain relief for people who only have months to live, but will make life markedly worse for anyone else that accesses it. We think it is far better for regulators to clearly make these calls than for people to make these decisions because they can consider the severity of a crisis, the efficacy of that medicine, and the harm of long-term effects. If AF wanted to win on this material, they had to prove that regulatory bodies withheld good drugs, and I don't think they're ever able to prove that claim. And obviously this harm extends to more people than it does under the status quo, because individuals are not idiots, but they are also not scientific experts. So if someone tells you that a drug works and that it will fix the specific problem that you were going through in a stressful period of your life, I think it's actually quite difficult for doctors to convince you that you ought not to take a drug that you are told is an available and accessible option for you. They then say that some vulnerable individuals will require this, but I think Grace deals with this quite well when she explains the immense harm that accrues to people that sink all of their money and efforts and hopes into treatments that will not work. It is obviously bad in these instances for hospitals to make these drugs available. But the final issue here is that obviously trust in the medical system goes down immensely if hospitals do administer treatments that harm people. And the negating team just relies on saying that it already happens to some extent, so no marginal difference is made. Clearly, when you expand the limit of people who might be harmed, that mistrust in the system also increases at a similar rate. So it is unclear to me why it is the case that people are still willing to put their trust in a system that administers medicines that harm them. Then on companies' incentives, I think we do a good job to explain that companies become more predatory when they're able to rely on things like advertising miracle drugs over actually putting in the investment to create medicines that fix all of the issues that the affirming team wants to talk about. If the issue in this debate is whether good drugs get made for problems that are currently unsolved, it's unclear why companies will put in the effort of paying millions of dollars for R&D like the affirming team suggests, when you could simply advertise your drug as a fix to that problem. It is clear that companies and individuals will act in harmful ways for their own self-interest in a world where you allow advertising of miracle drugs, so proud to oppose.
I'd like to thank the previous speaker for their remarks and invite the affirmative reply to conclude today's debate.
Ram. Oh, yeah. Am I visible and audible?
Yes, you are.
Judge, this reply speech is going to be simple. I'm going to give you two broad reasons on why affirmative team takes this debate. The first is, what is alternative medicine and why this team misses the accurate nuances of it? Secondly, why is consent so important and why we should allow individuals the choice to make a decision on what's best for them. First reason, what is alternative medicine and why this team misses the nuance? I think there are three things I just want to point out here. The first is, this team assumes that this debate is about either approved drugs or banned drugs when there can be drugs in between that don't have a status. Secondly, they assume that on our side, we will have unregulated forms of alternative medicine, but somehow they're able to co-opt this in their world with a regulated mechanism. This just doesn't make sense. The third is, there's a case shift in third negative when they said they understand that this might be bad, so state has a paternalistic value to not allow people to individuals to access this. They don't ban it, but they don't allow people to access this. How is this different from a ban? So we don't understand what the position on negative is. Let's make all of this clear. What was our position from the start? We explained to you that alternative medicine falls within the purview of medicine that don't have a status, which means it is not a banned drug, nor is it a drug that is approved. It is important to note that in all our speeches, we give you legitimate, backed and legally backed alternative medicine. This looks like stem cell, this is like Ayurveda. This team just misses and had all inaccurate context of where this debate take place and assume that we have to only debate on banned drugs. Judge, it's not our burden to defend taking banned drugs because obviously it's illegal. Obviously you can die out of drinking rat poison, and that's why this team misses the nuance and they're never reasonable and charitable to the things that we mentioned. And that's true because that is status quo on how alternative medicine is. They can't just pick and choose a world and say we have to defend all of these drugs. It's also important to note that the reason why, for example, Ivermectin is banned in the US, but it's not banned in India, goes to show that sometimes things are banned in different places according to the sample space and populations. So it's very unambiguous or very ambiguous for individuals to not be given that choice. We need to know exactly what this is. Secondly, it makes no sense for this team to accuse us of having hospitals administer banned drugs. If it's banned drugs, it's illegal to consume. You are liable as a hospital to administer those drugs. That means, according to your logic, if you as a patient, you want medical marijuana to be demanded for your treatment, will you protest and go out of the hospital? I want medical marijuana for my treatment of my cancer, for instance. It just doesn't make sense how people have the discretion to force doctors to give them the treatment. That's not how it works. So we were the team that told you what the framing of alternative medicine is, and they were wrong from very get-go. Second question, why is consent so important? The first preface to this reason is all the analysis are negative to suggest doctors are experts, doctors have oath. All are just mitigatory response to show that maybe they're great, but there are also lacunas there. That's why we provided 4 reasons that medical science can be doubtful. The fact of the matter is, vaccine takes about 5 years, but the COVID vaccine only takes 1 year to be produced. It's a natural inclination response that people can have to be doubtful, to be skeptical, especially when you see people are having serious side effects and like we don't know what the long-term impacts of this vaccine are. It's a right for individuals to have that form of doubt. Secondly, in terms of cost, things can be expensive. Thirdly, there is no cure. All of these reasons show that there's a lacuna in medical science and they never want to bridge with that. But finally, they said there's a third party harm because there's advertising. Let's compare this with big pharma that literally cares about profit and victimizes poorer countries. The evidence to that is when you see African countries pay significantly more for a vaccine than EU countries. So even if they were to say some models are bad and predatory, it's far worse with big pharma that cares about profit. At least there's accountability in our world and people make choice in deciding what's best for them. Panel, negative team wants you to believe that medical science is perfect. But I think believing that is a perfect way of manipulating individuals to think there is a cure when there isn't, thinking that they can afford it when they can't. At least people die in their world because of that decision. At least individuals have a second chance of rationalizing in our world. Extremely proud to affirm.
I'd like to thank all the speakers for their contributions to this debate. I invite them to cross the floor and digital fist bump in whatever way seems appropriate. And